this 22nd day of October. My name is Patricia, and I welcome you again to another edition of Alliance for Science Live. And today we are going to talk about GM salmon. And we have the pleasure of hosting Sylvia Wulf, who is the CEO of AquaBounty. And we also have our very own Greg Jaffe, who is our Director for Regulatory Affairs and Policy. So Greg will talk about the regulation, and Sylvia will give us the ins and outs of this GM salmon. Why was it created? The long process that they've gone through, almost 20 years, why the delay, and when this fish will be available in stores. So Sylvia, over to you.
Thank you, Patricia, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this morning. I joined AquaBounty almost 2 years ago after a long career in the consumer products industry, and most recently with US Foods, where I ran the meat, seafood, produce business for the second largest food distributor. And when I was approached about the opportunity at AquaBounty, it really checked 3 boxes that were important to me. The first was innovation with a purpose, and I believe our purpose is to provide healthy protein to an ever-increasing population. It was to do it in a sustainable fashion, and land-based recirculating aquaculture systems allow us to produce that salmon in an environmentally sustainable way. And lastly, to create a company, a culture that I would want to work for, and I believe others would want to work for. So I'm very excited to be part of AquaBounty as the first animal protein that's been approved for food use.
Okay, so Sylvia, please tell us what is why did you start this work as AquaBounty? Why was it necessary? Why was it necessary to genetically modify this fish? Of
right.
What advantage?
So the genetic modification took place 30 years ago, and the objective of the researcher was to help a fish survive at that point in time in an ocean pen in its very early stages of life. So that was the objective, was to keep it eating regardless of the climatic conditions. And if you think about 30 years ago, we weren't having the discussions that we're having about climate change today. And so what he did was he incorporated the growth hormone gene of a Chinook salmon into an Atlantic salmon. And what that really creates in the fish are 2 things. One, it eats consistently in its very early stages, so it is an accelerated growth curve in those early stages. And the other benefit that wasn't planned for is that it's very efficient in the way that it utilizes its feed. So we have about a 25% improvement in feed conversion versus a conventional salmon. And so we're creating more of a healthy protein with less resources. So that was the initial objective of the research that was done and the genetic modification that was made. And we have not changed that genetic structure in 30 years. And we're now on our 15th generation of our AquAdvantage Atlantic salmon.
Okay, so you've talked about the original objective that the scientists wanted to keep this fish eating. Why did you need it to do that? Yet naturally it goes into that let me call it non-eating stage. Was there a shortage of salmon on the market among the consumers that we needed to put out more fish? Because like you've explained, when you keep it eating, then it grows almost twice faster. So it reaches market in half the time. Was there a deficiency in the number of fish reaching the market?
So it really was more about protecting the fish if there was, for example, a super chill or it's warm. Salmon are interesting fish. They're very very picky about what they eat and when they eat. And so the conditions have to be right. So I like to say, you know, sometimes it's better to be lucky than smart. And what I mean by that is the original intention was to put those fish in an ocean pen. And really, what we're doing today is a much more environmentally sustainable approach to raising salmon, because we're doing it in a land-based facility with recirculating aquaculture. So we're using 97% of the water over and over again. And we're protecting the fish and the environment, because in our farms, they're highly biosecure, but more importantly, they have 6 levels of containment. So we protect the fish and we protect the environment. And so it's really a fish for today's times. That wasn't anticipated 30 years ago.
Okay. So when do we expect this fish to reach stores? It has been going on for 30 years. Is it ever
Right.
going to reach
and I know that Greg is going to speak to this, but it took 25 years to get regulatory approval in the US and Canada. And I think that, well, one, I think that it was a rigorous regulatory approval process because it was the first, and we needed to ensure that it was safe for the fish, safe for people, and safe for the environment. And I think that both FDA and Health Canada did a very thorough job ensuring that those criteria were met. So that's what took the 35 years or 25 years. We now have fish that are in production right now, swimming in tanks in Indiana and on Prince Edward Island. And we expect to bring our first harvest of AquAdvantage salmon really late in the 4th quarter of this year.
Ah, okay, that's interesting. Anytime soon. Okay. I would like for us now to pivot a little bit to Greg. Like I mentioned, yeah. Greg is the Policy and Regulatory Affairs Director with the Cornell Alliance for Science. And Greg, we would love for you to explain to us why this regulation has taken so long. Scientific work started 30 years ago. This GM salmon was only approved by the FDA in 2015. Why did it take so long?
So thank you, Patricia, and welcome to everybody. As Patricia said, I'm Greg Jaffe. I'm the Associate Director of Policy and Regulatory Affairs at the Alliance for Science. And I'm a lawyer by background, and I work in Washington, D.C., and I've been following the GE salmon for a long time in its process through FDA. I can say that I can't answer the question of why it's taken so long. That's a question for the regulators as well as for AquaBounty. I don't know when they put their final submission in. That regulatory system is somewhat not transparent in the sense that only limited information is available to the public, someone like myself. And so I can't comment on the length of time. I can tell you I have been involved in the process. In 2010, there was a veterinary medicine advisory committee meeting, and I was a member of that veterinary medicine advisory committee, which reviewed the environmental assessment and some of the data on the AquAdvantage salmon at the time. The application had been submitted sometime before then. Again, I don't know the date at which it was submitted before then, but I was part of that as the consumer representative on that committee, and I'm happy to talk about that experience or the results of that committee. What I thought I would do is give you a little background on what is the regulatory process in the United States for the salmon. They are regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. They're in charge of ensuring that the food supply in the United States is safe, and they're in charge for about 80% of our food. So they're in charge of all food with the exception of meat, poultry, and eggs. So that includes, you know, cattle, sheep, swine, goats, all fit, only catfish and eggs, and all poultry products. All the other food, which would include seafood and include the salmon, as well as plants and other foods, are regulated by FDA. So it's their job to ensure that there's safe food. They do that under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, a statute that's been in existence for a long time that wasn't really developed with the anticipation of biotech foods, whether they be crops or animals. And so FDA has tried to figure out how they can regulate these products. And for the genetically engineered animals, and this is not limited to food animals, but includes other genetically engineered animals, they've done that under the new animal drug provisions of the law. And at first you might think, well, these aren't drugs. That doesn't make any sense. And I think as a consumer and as a consumer representative, I sort of agree with that. I mean, you know, when we think of drugs, we think of something that you inject into an individual, or you give to an individual, whether that's an animal or a person. It's used in that generation. It's not inherited to future generations and so forth. But when you look at the definition under the statute that Congress passed, the definition talks about a drug is anything that alters the structure or function of the animal. And so there's this broad view of a drug. And so FDA has said that if you're genetically engineering an animal, if you're doing, as Sylvia said, adding a new gene, this case from an ocean perch, from a Chinook salmon with a promoter from an ocean perch, you are changing the structure or the function of the animal. And in particular, you're changing the structure of the DNA. And if you do it in one cell, and then all those other cells are grown from that one cell, each of those cells has a new structure in place. And they're saying that that gene that you're introducing, that little piece of DNA, is the regulated article, is the drug. And we can argue about whether that's a good interpretation or not. As a lawyer, I look at that and say, you know, I could see that making sense from a legal point of view. It may not make sense from a scientific point of view. It may not make sense from a consumer point of view, but from a legal point of view, I think you can make a credible case. And in fact, FDA has been challenged on that determination in court in California, and the court made a ruling on that issue and said that FDA was appropriately using its authority. So at least we have one court that said that that is an appropriate interpretation of that. So I'll just be a little briefer. I don't want to go on for too long. But if you have a new animal drug, there's a mandatory pre-market approval process. You can't use a drug for an animal drug in the United States without getting it approved or registered by the FDA. In order to do that, FDA has to ensure it's safe in three ways: that it's safe for the animal, that the drug you're giving to the animal is safe, that the food from the animal that anybody, humans or animals, would eat is safe, and that the drug is efficacious. And so those are the three areas that FDA needs to opine upon, and that's what they've done in approving the genetically engineered salmon. That found that those three areas. They also have to meet their NEPA obligations on the National Environmental Policy Act, and that gets to what is the environmental impact of the FDA's decision to approve that animal. And so they also look at that, and so they do all of that, and they make a decision. And the Veterinary Medicine Advisory Committee that I was involved with in 2010 had a public meeting and reviewed some of that data and gave its opinion back to FDA. There were most people on that committee who were much more expert than me on that committee, gave back their expert opinion on both the environmental issues and the food safety issues regarding that. I believe then then it took FDA a few years after that to make its decision, coming out with its final decision in 2015 that animal was safe for human consumption, and that there were conditions in the approval of that drug that limited its impact on potentially causing harm to the environment. So that, in a nutshell, is the process. Not the most obvious and everything. It has some advantages and disadvantages I'm happy to talk about, but I just wanted to let it out there.
Okay. Thank you, Greg. I would like to ask Sylvia to prepare to share your screen and show us this salmon that we are talking about. And so as you're preparing to do that, Greg, I would like to take you back just a little bit where you were talking about the three issues that FDA regulates. One is safety. And please remind us what these three issues are so that we are fully aware that this salmon is safe for human consumption. What are the other two?
So again, one issue is that any food from the animal that's gotten the drug is safe for human consumption, and that's a reasonable certainty of safety. That's the standard that the law requires. The second one is that the drug is safe for the animal. And again, doesn't really work so much with a genetically engineered animal, but think about it. If you were to give a drug to an animal, you want to make sure that drug does what it that it's safe to that, doesn't cause harm to that animal. So that's the second one. And the third one is that the drug is efficacious. And again, that one doesn't really work very well for genetically engineered salmon, but the idea in this case would be if the drug is supposed to, if the genetically engineered salmon, the gene is supposed to have it grow and get to market size in half the time, FDA would be opining about whether it does that, whether it actually achieves whatever goal it has in mind. So those are the three areas that FDA is required under the statute to ensure before they can approve it.
Okay, and that means that since GM salmon was regulated in 2015, it passed all those three criteria. So Sylvia, would you please just talk to us a little bit about what we are seeing on screen, and then we shall move into questions. They are coming in quite quickly.
Yes, and although I am not a scientist or certainly a regulatory expert, my understanding is that we needed to demonstrate that the genetic construct was stable. So we had to go through at least 2 generations of the salmon. And that salmon went through all of the normal food safety testing, allergenicity, toxicity, and basically what FDA said, with the exception of that one inserted gene, it's identical to Atlantic salmon. And the salmon that you see on the screen are salmon that are growing in our farm in Indiana. They look exactly like Atlantic salmon. They taste exactly like Atlantic salmon, and they behave like Atlantic salmon. They school naturally in these very large tanks. And we pride ourselves on making sure that those fish are well cared for in terms of our feeding protocols, our biosecurity, ensuring that the water quality and the oxygen is there for our fish to survive. And as I said, there was a question about concern of escape. We believe that we like building our farms in the heartland because we believe that aquaculture is going to be the next phase of agriculture. And it's a very, very healthy protein, salmon in particular. And so growing in the heartland where you have a history of agriculture, we believe is a really great opportunity for us. We build 6 levels of containment into those facilities, physical containment, and the eggs that are shipped from our broodstock facility in Canada are sterile females. And so up to 99.9%, we can guarantee that those females are sterile, so they can't reproduce. And then the other is, it'd be, as I said, unless they grow legs or sprout wings, there's no way that they can get out of those tanks. They're netted tanks because, again, the fish behave just like normal salmon, so they tend to jump because they're happy. And so we have nets over all of our tanks because we don't want the fish to exit those tanks. And so we're highly confident that there's no chance of escape. And therefore, no danger to an existing salmon population because they couldn't breed anyway.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sylvia. To our participants who've joined us, who have just joined us, I would like to remind us that today we are talking about the 3rd GMO in our GMO First series. So GM salmon is the 3rd, and please be on the lookout for more GMO Firsts. Next week we are going to have BT cowpea that will be focusing on Nigeria. But today we are about GMO salmon, and that is why we have Sylvia Wulf, who is the CEO of AquaBounty, the makers of this GM salmon that is actually called AquAdvantage salmon. And the advantage, there are so many advantages, but the consumer advantage is that this fish grows in almost half the time wild salmon does. It grows in half that, it reaches market weight in half the time. And we also have Greg Jaffe, who is the Associate Director of Policy and Regulatory Affairs with the Cornell Alliance for Science. Sylvia and Greg, I would like to now move into the questions, and depending on the question, you will decide who should answer what question. Sylvia, if you would please be kind enough and you can disable screen sharing. Our first question is coming in from Dana Pauls, and Dana is saying or asking, non-GMO is the fastest growing food sector. And all the major grocery stores have said they won't carry the GE salmon because of outstanding health and environmental risks. Where does AquAdvantage see an opportunity for public sales amidst this challenge? I think that is Sylvia.
So what I'd say is, having had discussions with a number of large retailers, that's a misstatement. They are not opposed to GE salmon. They have not said, other than Whole Foods, who doesn't believe in GMOs at all, that they wouldn't carry our salmon. And what I would say is, I think that even though non-GMO is a fast-growing category in the supermarket, it's really not based on science or safety, that perception that we're driving with consumers. And I think consumers, particularly in the US, need to really think about the fact that we have an affordable and accessible food supply because of GMOs, and that that affordability we take for granted. Other people in the world don't have access to the affordable food supply that we do. And I know that, you know, our government regulatory bodies do their job. These are career professionals who want to protect consumers. And so they're not approving products that are unsafe for human consumption. And maybe Greg, you could speak to perspective on GMOs versus non-GMOs.
I mean, I think that, you know, I'm not sure what to say there other than I think there's some portions of the market that are interested in non-GMO, and I think people have a right to choose and pick what foods they want to choose. I think there's concerns in the United States that the non-GMO market doesn't have, there's no definition, there's no legal definition of what non-GMO is. And so there's some misleading products out there that claim they're non-GMO when they may not be non-GMO, or when all products in that category may be non-GMO. And so I need, at least I know in my job with the Center for Science and Public Interest, we've always advocated for a national standard for non-GMO so that consumers who want that would be able to know and pay for what, get what they're paying for, instead of having private labels and private standards out there and individual companies self-determining whether they have something that's non-GMO. So I think we will have non-GMO in our markets for the immediate future. There is a market for that. I'm not going to comment whether it's getting bigger or smaller, but I do think that as it's gotten bigger, I think there's more need for government oversight to make sure that that's an accurate claim.
And I think you raise a very good point, Greg. Let's let the consumer choose. We will have a labeling standard in this country with the Bioengineered Disclosure Act. And so our fish will carry that designation. And you know, we're proud of the fact that we were genetically engineered for a purpose. And the research that we've done is there's a very vocal minority that is opposed to GMOs, so they don't have to buy it. But there's actually a large majority of people that have told us, you know what, if it's safe, which we can demonstrate, if it's affordable, which we know it will be, and if it's got the quality, because which is important, which we can deliver on because we're producing domestically, so there's a freshness aspect to it, we'll try it. And I believe that retailers owe consumers the right to make that choice, that informed choice. But that informed choice should be based on the science.
Okay.
If I might just jump in there, Patricia, one of the questions I see in the box is whether restaurants will be labeling this or whether it will be labeled in retail. And I think Sylvia mentioned that, and I'll just mention that there is a national bioengineered food disclosure law that was passed by Congress in 2016, signed by President Obama. USDA has finalized regulations on that at the end of 2018. That goes into effect starting in 2020 and will require compliance by January 1st of 2022. And in that disclosure, which is somewhat different than labeling, it could be on the package or it could be electronic, the USDA has identified 13 biotech, they have a list of 13 biotech foods, and one of those is the salmon. So if a salmon is sold in a retail establishment, there will be a requirement that that genetically engineered salmon be disclosed to the consumer. I will state to that question that there is an exemption in the law for restaurants. So food in restaurants is not labeled, just like you don't get other labeling in your food. You know, you don't get other labeling when you go to the restaurant about the calories or the fat content or the ingredient list of the foods that you're getting. Those other federal labeling requirements are exempt in restaurants. This federal labeling requirement is exempt in restaurants. So if you eat this genetically engineered salmon in a restaurant, there's not a requirement of disclosure. That restaurant might choose to disclose it. If you do purchase it in a retail establishment, there will be a requirement that it is disclosed.
Okay, thank you very much, Greg. So let us continue. An anonymous attendee, we would love to get to know your names if you don't mind. So please ask questions with your names. So this person is asking, is the first harvest of AquAdvantage salmon in Indiana still on track for Q4 of 2020? At the beginning of this webinar, Sylvia addressed that and she said, yes, it is still on track. So I guess the second question, Sylvia, is have any potential customers or distribution agreements been signed, even if you can't provide names?
We don't provide the names of our customers, but that's confidential information to the company. But yes, we do have customer relationships in place.
Okay. Maritza, before we go to Maritza, someone had raised their hands, and I would like to just mention that we shall not pick anyone raising their hands. So if you would please use the chat or the Q&A options, we shall read out your question or comment. So Maritza Mendoza is saying, have you consulted with indigenous people who have been managing salmon since time immemorial about genetically modifying their salmon? Sylvia?
Have we consulted, I'm sorry, have we consulted with who?
With the indigenous people who have been managing salmon since time immemorial, like 30 years ago, before this work started. Do you think they were consulted?
We've not, I don't know what the consultation would embody. We're not raising salmon in the, in the wild, or, I mean, these are in contained facilities. We've gone through the regulatory side, the scientific side of the process, but no, we've not had conversations with indigenous people.
Okay. So Muhammad Hassan is saying, how will we differentiate between GMO salmon with the normal, or let us call it the wild? I think Greg has addressed this, but other than what the regulation says, if I look at salmon, the wild one and the GMO one, Sylvia, can I be able with my naked eye to tear them apart?
No, you wouldn't. They look exactly like conventional Atlantic salmon, which is typically a farmed variety. Those are the ones that are grown in the ocean pens, as opposed to other species of salmon, which are wild caught. And one of the benefits that we believe we bring is by being able to produce more in a land-based facility, we're going to take the pressure off the oceans, either from a fisheries perspective or from an environmental animal welfare perspective with the ocean pens. And that, we're going to be able to fill that gap between demand and supply for this healthy protein. So we think that this is an advantage, and our fish being able to grow faster and eat more efficiently, we believe begins to fill that gap in a very sustainable way.
Looks like I am muted. Lisa Colligan is just saying hello. She's saying this is so exciting. Thanks for hosting this webinar. We are hosting a watch party, and at the Uprooted and Rising Facebook page. Feel free to shout out. Lisa, thank you very much. And also, given the situation today that we couldn't also live stream on our own Facebook page. So thank you very much. The next question comes from still an anonymous person, and he or she is saying AquaBounty's Panamanian facility was given maximum fines for mismanagement. What will AquaBounty do in the case of a natural disaster or human error resulting in escaped fish, like what happened in Panama?
So Panama was a very, very small research facility that was a flow-through facility, not a tank-based facility. And it is now no longer in operation. Our farms, as I said, have very strict biosecurity and standard operating procedures. One of what I call the benefits of being regulated by the FDA is we're actually operated as an animal pharmaceutical facility. And so it requires rigor that other land-based fish farms won't require. And so that's forced us to be really good at managing those farms. And as I said before, we have 6 levels of physical containment at the farm, as well as the fact that 99.9 roughly % of those eggs are sterile females. And so we believe that the risk, there's always an infinitesimal risk of escape, but even if the fish escaped, it's not a risk to any wild population because we're located in the Midwest where salmon are not native. That's another reason why we select where we select to place our farms.
Thank you, Sylvia, for that. Still, Dana is back, and Dana is saying, Sylvia, there has been several independent scientific studies showing GE salmon do breed with wild species, including Indiana's brown trout and wild salmon. With a natural disaster, I think, Sylvia, you've just addressed this question, so we shall skip to the next one. Why didn't AquaBounty do an endangered species assessment? How does the company know it won't have an impact without doing an assessment?
The FDA did an ESA assessment as part of the approval of the facility. And I trust the FDA that they did what they were required to do. And given the fact that they knew that there would be tremendous scrutiny on the approval of the first genetically engineered animal, I believe that the agency went above and beyond because they knew that there'd be challenges. And so I trust those professionals. And quite frankly, you know, with the passion that I have around our environment and sustainability, I'm confident that this is an incredibly environmentally sustainable way to grow a very healthy protein, which we need to continue to do because we have a huge protein gap in feeding 9 to 10 billion people around the world. And so, you know, I'm committed to making sure that we manage those farms in a sustainable and biosecure fashion, because again, that's part of who we are and our purpose.
Okay.
If I might just jump in there,
Yeah.
Patricia.
Thanks,
So I think that question, maybe to the person who asked that question, I don't believe that the Endangered Species Act requires the government agency to do the assessment. So while the developer may provide some data for that, the statute as written for an endangered species assessment requires the agency to do that. And we can understand why we want that. We want that to be done in an independent way by the independent scientists at those agencies. And so I think Sylvia is correct that FDA did what they believed was correct under that law to assess whether there was any impacts on endangered species from growing these salmon. The one other thing I'll mention is there is a court case about the salmon that still, as I mentioned, they've made some decisions. And I believe that one of the decisions the court has made, there were claims brought about whether they violated the Endangered Species Act. And I believe that the court upheld that portion of FDA's decision so far, that in fact, they were appropriate in how they addressed the Endangered Species Act. So, and if anything, if you're okay, Patricia, there was another question I think may have missed.
Greg, can I just correct you? Just make one slight correction.
Okay.
The case was in 2 parts, and the court ruled that the FDA had jurisdiction, and we're waiting for his ruling on the ESA component of the case.
Okay. And that was the other, so the question, there was a question from Ian Gizzard that was at the beginning, Patricia, but it was in the answered part. And the question is, there's been some talk of a judge overturning the biotech salmon approval. Is there a real threat? And so I wanted you to say that this case, as Sylvia said, is ongoing. The court did decide that FDA was appropriate in regulating this under the new Animal Drug Act. There are still questions about its decision on the the Endangered Species Act, and also its views on how it conducted its National Environmental Protection Act environmental assessment and whether that was adequate. So Ian, the answer is, depending on how the judge decides those, they could overturn the decision. That is one option the court could have. The court could decide that FDA did not appropriately do what it was required to do under the National Environmental Protection Act, and that it needs to go back and do that. And until it does that, the decision is null. But it also could decide that FDA has to go back or it could decide that FDA did a good job and the decision goes forward. Or it also could take a middle decision. It could decide that FDA needs to go back and do some additional analysis, but that in the interim, the decision can go forward, or that the current salmon that are being grown could be sold and utilized, but new salmon might not be able to be grown. The court really has a lot of discretion as to, depending on what it decides, to depend what the remedy might be. So one remedy could be overturning the decision, but there are lots of other remedies, even if the court determines that FDA didn't do what it was supposed to do under all the relevant federal laws.
Thank you, Greg. We have quite a bit of interest and a number of questions, so I would like to ask Greg and Sylvia to be a little bit brief so that we can pack in as many questions. But we are also not going to run out of time. We shall go for an extra 30 minutes. Heather Day is still asking about the indigenous people, and Sylvia, I think you responded to this question. Should I read it out? Do you think you need to? Yeah, maybe it's coming up again. Sylvia, please reiterate your response. She's saying the Salmon people, who are AquAdvantage, being represented by Sylvia today. Coast Salis tribes in the Northwest have made their opposition to GE Salmon known until a full environmental impact statement and further scientific review is completed and formal consultation with Northwest Treaty tribes is undertaken. Why hasn't AquaBounty consulted with Northwest tribes whose lives have depended on salmon for millennia? Just to reiterate what you said earlier, Sylvia.
So I think that this is a new method of farming, and we're using science as a tool to solve global problems. It's not that I don't respect indigenous people, I certainly do. But I also believe that science moves us forward, and that's something that we really need to stay focused on. Well-regulated science is where we should be focused. And again, we're not threatening indigenous people. We're growing salmon to feed that, a growing population of healthy protein, which I think is critical. It's a global challenge that we face.
Thank you, Heather, for your correction. I had said I had referred to AquaBounty as the Salmon people, but she has corrected me, and she says the Northwest indigenous people call themselves the Salmon people. Thank you very much for that correction, Heather. So over here in the chats, we have Maritza, who is saying, can we also stream it on FB, as stated in the description? Yes, Maritza, if you can, on your own private Facebook page, but for the Cornell Alliance for Science, like I mentioned at the beginning, we experienced some technical difficulties and we are not able to live stream this on Facebook. However, we are recording this and we shall upload it on our YouTube page, maybe 2-3 days from now. Naj, let me see this full name. Naj is saying, is there a non-zero chance that these fish will escape or reproduce? Sylvia has responded to this already. She said 99% there is, these female fishes are sterile, so they will not reproduce, and neither will they escape, because she also talked about the location of where they are breeding this fish from. It's far from the Atlantic, from the ocean. Dana Pals, we have responded to you. What made you go this route for salmon when there are safer ways to increase salmon production? For instance, removing dams, 90% of which provides less energy than generators. let me give you the name of this person before you respond. Okay, Sylvia, please go ahead. Wasn't there a better way?
We believe that, you know, there are quotas on wild-caught salmon. And I think those are, you know, we need to make sure that we enforce those quotas to protect the wild population. And so there's only so many salmon that you can harvest every year. And then with respect to those Atlantic salmon that are farmed in ocean pens, there are limits on the number of licenses. And then again, those fish are exposed to disease and predators and the climate conditions. And so it's tough for those types of farmers to raise fish the way that we can in a land-based recirculating aquaculture system. So we believe that this type of precision farming is the future, because we are able to produce more with less. And that's, and there is a gap between supply and demand. And we believe that our salmon is going to enable us to begin to fill that gap for consumers.
Dwayne is saying AquGenomic ETF holds 4.5 million plus shares. That speaks volumes to the viability of the technical and your leadership, Sylvia. I think that's a compliment to you, Sylvia. Dwayne is saying, go ahead. We see what your experience speaks on your behalf. Ian Gazad, can you scale this up quickly so that we can reduce pressure on our oceans? Sylvia, can you bring this salmon faster than the last quarter of 2020? That's what Ian is asking.
No, you know, the life cycle of the salmon is 18 months. And so we can't grow it in less time. And we need to construct more of these land-based farms. So there's a lot of focus on that. The company is focused on that.
Sylvia, just to understand you said the life cycle of salmon is 18 months and you can't do any faster, but earlier AquaBounty is about
18 months is AquAdvantage. A traditional salmon is 28 to 30.
Oh, okay. So can't you bring it to quarter? Can't you bring it less than 18?
Yeah.
Okay. Still, this is Heather Day, and she's saying you claim that AquAdvantage fish grows faster. What is the percentage from the technology of land-based recirculating aquaculture systems, and what percentage from the genetically modified salmon?
So all of the growth acceleration comes from the genetic modification. The benefit of the land-based farming is it's grown in a protected environment, and it allows us to better use our natural resources like water and feed.
David Smith, to both panelists, do you think your farms can reduce fishing pressure on wild salmon populations?
I don't believe so, and I don't think that that's certainly not one of our objectives. We believe that wild caught definitely has a place in the supply chain, and what we would say is enforcing the quotas to protect that wild population is going to be critical going forward. But they play an important role in the salmon supply.
And I just might mention, I mean, I'm not an expert on salmon and the salmon market, but I just want people to understand out there that at least in the United States, if you go in the store and buy salmon, the vast majority of that salmon, unless it specifically says it's wild caught, and there are some Alaskan salmon and some Northwest salmon that are wild caught, not very much these days in the East Coast, I don't believe at all. Most of it is farm raised salmon, and that comes either from Chile or South America or from Norway. And so, you know, we get hundreds of thousands of tons of imported salmon every year to the United States from these farm raised salmon. And I think that, again, I'm not an expert in this area, but I think there's been lots of documentation about some of the environmental impacts and issues around aquaculture in large pens in these locations. But that is where the vast majority of the less expensive salmon that most of us buy in the supermarket comes from.
And Greg, you make a very good point. The other consideration is salmon are cold water fish, which is why they're farmed in the areas that Greg referenced. And so land-based farming allows us to produce close to consumption, reducing the carbon footprint and creating a freshness advantage as well. And what we've seen with COVID is we have, we have a fragile supply chain that we just didn't see that. And so this gives us domestic capability.
Heather is saying Coastal says it won't sell genetically modified salmon. Yes, Heather, you're right. Sylvia is shaking her head, but just before we get to Sylvia and Greg earlier on stated it categorically that this is not about forcing anyone.
Nope, you're on mute.
We lost you.
We lost you, Patricia.
Am I back? Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
you said
Yes,
Sylvia and Greg said categorically, and then we missed the rest of it. So we want to know what we said.
So Sylvia and Greg said categorically earlier that GM salmon or any other GMO is about choice. Okay, if you don't want to buy it, please don't buy it. But there are some people who would choose to buy it, and let us give them the opportunity to have this choice. But Sylvia, you were shaking your head when I said Coastal said it won't be selling GMO salmon. Do you want to add something?
They said not yet.
Not yet.
They will continue to evaluate whether or not there's consumer demand for our salmon. And again, it's all about consumer choice.
Yes.
And I'll just mention that, Sylvia has talked about salmon from a single facility that's going to be harvested and put into the marketplace. That's going to be a very small fraction of all the salmon that's out there. So there will be many opportunities. Most of the salmon that's out there will not be genetically modified, at least for the immediate future. So to the extent that consumers want to avoid this, I think that'll be fairly easy to do. And I'm not taking a position about whether they should avoid it or not avoid it. But if there is a consumer who wants to avoid it, I think that will be easy. I actually think it'll be the consumer who wants to buy it. It will be actually hard to find it. But Sylvia could correct me if I'm wrong about that. So I think that, and as I said, the law will require that it be disclosed if it's in a retail setting to the consumer under the ways that the law allows disclosure.
Okay. Nicole Rodriguez is saying, how will the price of AquaBounty compare to that of regular salmon? As a dietitian, I see AquaBounty as potentially removing the barrier to increasing fish consumption. Yeah. Sylvia, that's for you.
Our plan is to price it.
Sylvia, I have another question that I would like for you to address in relation to this. When you said that there is a protein gap in the US, I don't know, do you have any figures, or Greg, do you have figures for this protein gap?
Globally, there's a protein gap, and there's definitely yeah.
I don't, that's not my area of expertise, but my unexpert opinion would probably be there's not a big protein gap in the United States, but I don't know that for certain.
There isn't one in the US, but we have an opportunity to change the protein to different, we as a population, the US consumes much less seafood than other places in the world. And so this provides an alternative that's affordable and accessible for a healthy protein.
Yes, but please, Sylvia, talk to us about the price, if you have any figures in mind.
Yeah, our plan is to price at commodity pricing and to make this affordable for consumers, because we want to encourage ever improving nutrition in this country, and we want to make it affordable to those that may not have been able to either have access to it or afford it in the past. And so we're going to continue to work on the cost structure and continuing to make sure that it's affordable.
So Sylvia, simply put, it's going to be cheaper than conventional. Is that what you're saying?
Not necessarily. It'll be priced at parity with the most economic of salmon that is brought to market today. And the other thing is that we can control the cost. And so we can have consistent pricing.
Okay. to continue, Heather, we have a lot of Heather. Let me look for, give other people an opportunity. If we have time, Heather, we shall ask your question. So Stephen is saying, let the consumer choose. Is such a myth, because when people know so little about their food and are so strapped for money, we don't have time to learn about our foods. So it's just manipulative to say, let the consumer choose, without doing a campaign explaining the potential risks of GE animals. Why does Stephen assume that there are potential risks? Greg started us off by telling us that FDA has certified the safety of this GM salmon. But Greg, please reiterate the safety again so that people like Stephen can know.
Right. So I think what I would say to Stephen is, FDA does have a mandatory pre-market approval process for genetically engineered animals, where they have to ensure that the food from the animal that has that drug has a reasonable certainty of no harm. That's a very high food safety standard. And in this case, they've determined that FDA has determined that. So I think, for consumers, they should feel comfortable that FDA has looked at this as an independent and determined the food safety issues. And that's what we're most concerned about when we're purchasing something at the supermarket. I know as a consumer myself, I don't want to have to make an independent decision when I go to the supermarket about whether the foods I buy are safe to eat or not. I really do want the FDA to make those determinations. And I want to, when I go to the store, choose among all safe foods. And I think consumers can feel comfortable that if they do want to purchase an engineered salmon, that the safety data has been reviewed by FDA and determined that it's safe to eat. That may be different if they want to have they have other values such as sustainability or natural or other types of things. That's a different thing, and that they can do their own research for. But I think from the government's point of view, it is to ensure that foods are safe before they get to the market. I think that they've done that in this case for the genetically engineered salmon. Then consumers can choose whether they want to purchase it or not for other reasons.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but not for safety. Noel is saying, if the majority of consumers are in favor of genetically engineered food, why does the Alliance for Science put so much energy into pro-biotech communication, such as the project It Modified? Sylvia and Greg, may I please also chip in on this? Noel,
Yeah.
I can respond to this in my capacity as Associate Director of Training with the Cornell Alliance for Science. We are putting so much effort, and thank you for noticing our effort in pro-biotech communications, because we are about choice, okay? And people cannot have choice unless they have accessibility. That is what It Modified is about, that track that, brings GM food closer to people. So it's about accessibility so that people can exercise their choice. But also outside the US and in different communities, like in Africa, where I come from, the choice is not even there, okay? We want to communicate more about genetically engineered foods and this technology and what it can do for our people where I come from, so that we avail them with this choice, just like we are doing in the US. That's why we are putting in so much energy, accessibility, so that we can foster choice. Greg, if there is anything you would like to add on that.
I don't think so.
Okay, thank you. Mark is saying the Canadian government scientists ranked the environmental hazard of GE salmon to wild Atlantic salmon as high. Can you please comment?
I don't believe that's a true statement, because they also approved our facility on PEI. We need to go through the same rigorous assessment with the Canadian regulatory authorities as we do with the FDA. I mean, Canada's again, the Canadian government wants to protect their aquaculture industry because it's actually more advanced than the US. So.
Okay. Greg, this is yours from Heather. She's saying the FDA approved AquAdvantage salmon in November 2015, despite the 1.8 million people who sent letters to them opposing approval. And 75% of respondents to a New Times poll said they would not eat genetically engineered salmon. How can you say a majority of people have told you that they want this salmon? Any of you, Sylvia or Greg?
So I mean, I don't think I've said whether a majority of people want or don't want the salmon. I don't know if there have been polls out there to suggest one way or the other. I don't doubt the numbers of people who submitted comments to FDA. FDA does look at all of the comments, but unfortunately, the way the law is set up, FDA is limited to making a decision based on those three factors that I talked about. And if they determine that the food, that the drug is efficacious, the drug is safe for the animal, and food made from the animal is safe to eat, then they are required under the law to give that developer a registration of that. They're not taking, if they don't take into account a public opinion poll of whether people want or don't want this. That at least in the US government system, generally our regulation deals with safety, and we leave those other issues to the marketplace. And so if people don't want it, they won't purchase it in the market. But FDA doesn't make its decisions. They stick to making the decisions based on science and based on what Congress has allocated for them to make a decision upon. So I'm sure, as somebody who used to work in the government, that the agency looked at all of those comments and read them all, and they cared deeply about the opinions of the American public. But when it comes to making a decision, they're limited to comments that are relevant to the issue before them. And the issue is not whether people want this, but whether it's safe. And in the marketplace, we'll make a decision. And you can understand why we do that. I mean, the government shouldn't be deciding winners or losers in the marketplace. You wouldn't want the government to say, oh, yeah, well, organic is safe, but we don't want, we're not in favor of organic, and so we're not going to allow it into the marketplace. If it's safe, then it should be put in the marketplace, and consumers will choose or not choose to buy a product. And so that's just some context about that decision.
Dan Kuniski saying, fantastic job, Sylvia and AquaBounty. Please keep up the great work. The Alliance should be fact-checking and screening these questions. Many are based on completely untrue statements. Thank you for that observation, Dan. Leovold is saying this can help end world hunger. Most of these claims are exaggerated or simply false fear-mongering. So you won't eat broccoli? Go AquaBounty. No. Noel is saying regulation under animal drugs sets a dangerous precedent for future genetically engineered animals. It does not at all capture the systematic biological and ecological risks of GE species outside the lab. Greg, I think that is for you.
So I'm not the one who's going to say that the new animal drug method of regulating genetically engineered animals is by far the best method. There are advantages to that system. It is a mandatory pre-market approval system. I think it has a very high food safety standard. I think it doesn't give FDA potentially the authority they want on the environmental issues. That's an issue still being determined in the court case. It's not the most transparent and participatory system. I've written about that in the past. But it does, I think, ensure the food safety. And so it does have a very strong food safety component. Could we design a new system from scratch? We probably could. That might be better. That would have to go through Congress and get authorized into law. And so far in the United States, there hasn't been an interest in doing that. So for the time being, this is the system we have, and we have to make the best of it.
And I'd like to build on what Greg said. Biotechnology is an ever evolving field. And when we started 30 years ago, we didn't have the capabilities that we do today and just a genetic understanding. And so I think that our regulation isn't going to keep pace with the pace of the science. And I think that's something that we're going to need to address, because I believe that biotechnology is a tool for the future, whether it's addressing climate change, nutrition, creating more affordable and accessible food. It's a tool that we ought to use, and we need regulatory processes that are transparent and risk-based.
Okay. We have so many questions, but I would like to bring this to a close and also remind our participants that Greg works as the Associate Director for Policy and Regulation with the Alliance for Science. Sylvia is the CEO of AquaBounty, and you can reach out to these people individually through their emails and continue this conversation. Or we could come back again another time. But I want Greg to reiterate the 3 areas where the FDA regulates when it comes to GM salmon. And Sylvia, I would like for you, as we come to a close, and take your time, we are not rushing you, to remind us of what the AquAdvantage advantage is. Why is this salmon coming onto the market? Why should we be eagerly waiting for it? Why should we be rooting for this salmon to come onto the market? Because I would like to remind our participants that this is a GMO first. It's the first animal that has been regulated for human consumption. And that means it's going to set a great precedence for whatever animal that's going to come in the future. And to just make it clear, the Cornell Alliance for Science is for science. What the science says is what we go with. So the science has said that GM salmon is safe for human consumption, and so we are for GM salmon. So over to you, Greg, and then to Sylvia.
So I'll just reiterate that, the genetically engineered salmon, as well as any other genetically engineered animal, will be regulated under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act as new animal drugs. And as Patricia said, when FDA, and that requires a mandatory pre-market approval process. And that approval process, FDA has to determine that the drug is safe for the animal, that the drug is efficacious, and that the drug, any food from the animal given the drug, is safe to eat, and with under a reasonable certainty of no harm standard. So it's a fairly protective statutory system for the food safety aspects of it. There are problems to that regulatory system, and in the past I've actually worked with members of Congress to introduce legislation to improve that system, to give FDA authority to address the environmental issues, to make it more transparent, to make it more participatory. And so I think if you have questions or concerns about FDA's approval process, the issues are less with FDA and with Sylvia's company. It's more with Congress, and requiring Congress to do a better job. And I'll mention also, we've mentioned the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Law that will require the salmon in the retail situation to be disclosed. It won't require it to be disclosed in restaurants. And again, I know there have been a number of questions about that. And again, I think that's if people have concerns about that, that's an issue to raise with Congress. Congress is the ones who made that exemption. AquaBounty didn't make that exemption, or any individual company didn't do that. That's what Congress did. The government's enforcing that. And so there are arguments for disclosure in a restaurant for many different foods, but Congress hasn't chosen to go there so far. So I think it's something that if the public wants, they should let that be known.
Thank you, Greg. Sylvia, what is the AquAdvantage salmon advantage?
So the advantage is that we're able to produce more of a healthy protein because it grows faster. We can do it in a land-based recirculating aquaculture system environment, which allows us to use our natural resources more effectively. It protects the oceans because we're taking the strain off wild caught, and also the need to build more ocean pens by using this type of farming with this type of fish. And I think the last thing is that our fish are highly efficient in the way that they process their feed. And so again, we're creating more with less in a very sustainable way. And we're looking forward to bringing our salmon to market. And to Greg's point, You know, I believe that there's opportunity for improvements to the regulatory system. We're a very, very small company, and we've fought, you know, we've battled for many years to be able to provide that choice to consumers. And so we're looking forward to our first harvest. And thank you very much, Patricia and the Cornell Alliance for Science, for inviting me today.
Okay. Thank you, Greg and Sylvia, for sharing your time and knowledge with us. And our participants, we appreciate that you have put aside this time to come and listen in or challenge Sylvia and Greg on these matters of genetically modified salmon. But like Greg said, the FDA has certified the salmon to be safe. So if you choose not to eat it, I'm sure you will choose that on, you know, it will be a different reason than safety. And Sylvia has raised our hopes in the last quarter of 2020, which I think is, we've started. So very soon our eyes are on you, Sylvia. This salmon should be in US stores. A 30-year-old wait is going to come to an end. Thank you very much. Same place, same time. Please join us next week, where we shall be talking about another GMO first, BT cowpea in Nigeria. Thank you very much, and have a good evening for people who are in my part of the world, and a good morning to Sylvia and Greg and to the rest of you. Thank you.
Thank
Bye
you.
now.
Bye-bye.